Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to another Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this November 2nd. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Oren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And hey, look, I hope everyone had a great, happy, and safe Halloween. You're out of your candy coma, and October is behind us. That is in the rearview mirror. Coming straight ahead at 100 miles an hour is November, and just a whole bunch of awesomeness from the Dollar Bin Bandits. And today, we're presenting you with yet another awesome episode, our interview with Richard Bruning. Richard has a really interesting career. He's kind of done a lot of different things over the years. His career has deviated a few times, but every time he seems to always come back to comics in some way. He's worked at HBO, even Children's Television Workshop, but he's made his way back to comics, which I think is just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's really hard to think of Vertigo line of comics without thinking of their logo and the fact that he was pretty much the man behind it all. It's little things like that that sometimes fly under the radar, but make a huge impact in the world of comics. That's exactly what he's done.
Yeah, Richard is a design director by trade. And so, a little unsung, this kind of role in comic books. We always talk about the artists, we always talk about the writers, and they play major roles. But without the designers, putting together the looks of these books, how they're branded, the logos, just, page to page, it really wouldn't be comics as we know it. So we have designers and design directors like Richard Bruning to thank for that. So let's talk to him. This is Richard Bruning.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. We will get started with the same question we ask everybody, which is, how did you discover comic books?
I discovered comic books as a very small child, probably 4 or 5, around there. I had scarlet fever, which I don't even know people get anymore. But I was stuck in bed for a while, and my father brought home a box of comic books to keep me occupied, which was great. I hadn't read too many comic books because I was relatively young, but I literally learned to read off of them because of the interaction between the pictures and the words. It was a very good learning tool for me. The only thing that confused me was that the comics all had the top third of their covers torn off. So I wasn't sure what book I was reading. My question to you guys is, do you know why that would be?
For returns, for to send back to the company so that they know how many were sold.
Right. They tear off the top third, send it to the distributor, get credit for it. Then they'd sell it on the gray market for, nothing, because comic books were worth very little then, or the price was very low. But anyway, so that kind of hooked me. And then I started drawing because I wanted to do the same thing these guys were doing. And that I pursued that for 20 years or so.
I'm going to ask the follow-up question that our pal Joe always asks, which is, do you have any of those original top third removed comics anywhere in your collection?
No way. No. I've had a number of collections either destroyed by flood or stolen, and I have nothing of those original books.
Oh, no.
That's tough.
What do you do?
They're in your memory. That's what counts.
Concretized right up here.
So one of your early jobs in comics was working for Capital Comics. How did you get into that position, and what was the independent comic scene like when you first started there?
Yeah, well, there was a few things going on in independent comics at that point. I got involved in probably like 1979, I'd say. I had been living in Madison, Wisconsin for a number of years. I was there for about 8 years. And I had a graphic design studio, and one of my earliest clients was Phil Suling, if that name rings a bell to anybody, one of the first of the distributors. And I did some ads for him and stuff. And then actually first, after that, I actually worked on Eclipse Comics for a while. That was my first official art director's job. And I worked with Dean Mulaney on putting together Epic Magazine and the comics and stuff. And that didn't last too long because it was Dean and whatever. But at that time, one of my clients was a comic book distributor, Capital City Comics. Capital City Distribution. It was one of the early distributors along with Diamond and such. And I met these guys and got to work with them a little bit. And they saw that I could do design, and they were like, maybe you should do all of our design work. And they were like a two-person company at that point. And so my goal was to make them look like they were a much bigger company. And I guess it worked, and they grew, not just because of me, obviously. But after a number of years, I think it was Pacific first started getting into the independent publishing venue, cutting out the middleman, distributor, editor, boom. Just put the talent right out the door. And so Milton Griep and John Davis, who were the owners of Capital City Distribution, they asked me if I wanted to start a comic book company with them. And I was like, well, yeah, duh. I had no idea how to do this. I'm a self-taught art director and designer. I have no degrees. But I found I had a real affinity early on in my life for graphic design. And because of my knowledge of comics and that, I was the art director and editor-in-chief for Capital Comics, which was an extraordinarily small company, but I was able to learn everything about how you produce a comic book just by learning how to do it. And it was a wonderful experience. It was difficult, but it was a wonderful experience. And I learned a lot from that. It was interesting because, you had First Comics and Pacific and other people, and nobody knew exactly what they were doing or what they were trying to do because it had always been Marvel and DC and Archie. And now there were real efforts to make another major publisher in the industry, which was extraordinarily difficult if you don't have the quantity of titles like DC or Marvel have to put out. But we did Nexus and Badger and Whisper, and we did that up through, I think, 1984.
Now, did you guys see yourself as competition for DC and Marvel, or did you see yourselves as an alternative to DC and Marvel?
That's a good question. I don't think if you had any reasonable assumptions that you would think you were going to compete with Marvel or DC, even back then. It was really a matter of whether you could bring something new to the table. And that's certainly what we tried to do with Nexus, which was created by I was in Madison, Wisconsin at that time, like I said, and there was a writer, Mike Barron, who was a great hustler, and he had connected with an artist, Steve Rude, who was a young guy, just starting out, but absolutely passionate about being a good artist, a great artist. And once they heard that Capital was going to get into publishing, Mike pitched Nexus. And it was just like he had a fresh take on it. It was similar to like what the British did in the 80s in comics later on in the 80s. They brought a fresh perspective to what the stories could be and would be, because comics are pretty stodgy, let's face it, in the early 80s. So we tried to produce the best looking comics that we could, full color, and put them on nice paper and do good design work and good presentation. And that just kind of took off from there.
What was your first reaction to seeing Steve Rude's art? Because to me, it's some of the most underrated covers ever done.
Steve he's a unique individual. Mm-hmm. But the greatest thing about working with Steve is he always was drawing. He was constantly drawing, and he would have a sketchbook with him all the time. So every time he'd come into the office to bring in some pages or something, we go over the pages, I tried to tear them apart as kindly as I could. There weren't very many mistakes, but a lot of it comes down to just basic storytelling. Some artists are good at drawing, but they're not so good at storytelling. Not that Steve was good at storytelling, but that was one of the few areas that he could use a little bit of improvement on. But he always had his sketchbook, and I would always flip through it. And wherever he went, he was drawing all the time. He was absolutely dedicated to it. So that was very encouraging for me as a new editor or art director to work with somebody like that wanted to be good so much.
Now, when things started to shut down a bit for Capital, was there a deal in place with First to take on those books, or did that come later on?
No, it kind of came pretty much organically. We had done 6 issues of Nexus, 3 issues of The Badger, and 1 or 2 issues of Whisper. And like most independent publishers, you're just bleeding money at a certain point. There's just not enough. The sales weren't good enough to support. People were interested and they were buying, but it wasn't enough to really support the business.
Right.
And so rather than declare bankruptcy, I worked with John and Milton. I said, we got to find a way to pay our bills and get these properties somewhere. And to Milton's credit, he negotiated a deal with First so that the work could continue, the bills would get paid. And we had a very good relationship with First. They were very nice people. At that time, anybody like that was like it was your buddy. Anybody in the independent publishing was your buddy. So yeah.
I'm a bit biased. I'm a big Nexus and Badger fan, but do you think those 2 books get the credit they deserve for, I guess, helping the 80s independent books sort of take off? Because they were very popular at the time. They still are.
Yeah, they were. I mean, Mike had come up with something unique, and Steve's work was so strong, especially for such a young artist of any age, really. No, I don't think they got the recognition, but it's hard to say from being inside that whether people appreciated us enough or not. Mike went on after I went to DC in '85. Mike came over to DC and did a number of projects there. But he had a different take, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work enough.
Right. Makes sense.
So after a little bit of freelancing, after this period of time in your work with the independent comics, you land at DC as a design director. And, I wanted to explore that a little bit. You've already mentioned design and look and feel of books, but can you explain for the layperson or for even comic fans that don't really pay attention to what design is other than the art? What are we talking about when we say design? Like what are the elements that a design director would manage?
Oh, yes. When I first got involved in comics in the late 70s, comics were pretty generic in terms of their presentation. There was a logo, there was a cover image, the book is inside, there's ads and shit, and that's it. There's really no design outside of specifically the logo itself. But I thought part of the problem was that, you had the 98-pound weakling ads in there. You had the, grow your own, what was it, sea fish or something like that.
Yes.
It was kind of a junky looking publication. And we weren't getting much respect as comic book producers, as publishers in the aggregate, not just what I was working with. And it frustrated me. And because I knew that good design mattered to people because they responded to it well, it made them think more seriously about what was going on in front of them. And so that was always one of my things from the beginning of Capital Comics, was to find a way to integrate design into the books, meaning that everything should look like it's top class, well thought out, not just a letter column with the same 7/8 point type and narrow columns or whatever. No junky ads if you could avoid it. and just to try to step up the level of comics to what was the standard for other types of publications, like especially magazines. Comics are unique in that they're not prose books, but they're not magazines either. Really, they're weird hybrid in between. So I probably, for me, one of the greatest things I will always be grateful for is that I was able to push good design, good packaging, and good presentation into comics as much as I could. And I was given a lot of opportunity to do that.
Well, two of the titles that everybody is probably familiar with, which I think their design is very underrated, but I think certainly supports their success, at least as far as I'm concerned, were the pivotal graphic novels, or at that point series, Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns.
Mm-hmm.
When those were brought to you, did you think that, okay, these are something special and they deserve some sort of identifying design that gives them more gravitas than, I'd say, a regular comic book? Not that they don't have gravitas, but that there was just something that design could help prop up or bring out from those books.
You're absolutely right. I was extremely fortunate in the timing in my life that after learning how to do comic books without any rules around it at Capital Comics, then when I got hired at DC in '85, based off my work on Capital, happy to say, I walked in the door and in production was Watchmen, Dark Knight, Killing Joke, and they were just starting to come in the door as stories. And one of my proudest moments in comics is that I talked DC out of putting ads in Watchmen comics. It was going to be a normal 28-page story, 32-page package, the 6-page ad flat that normally goes in. And yeah, I could tell this was something special. This was something different. And fortunately, Dick Giordano, who's the head of editorial at that time, was willing to listen to me. And everybody that saw the work, they kind of knew it was something different, but they had never really done anything different. The closest thing was Camelot 3000. Before that, or more importantly, before that, was Ronin by Frank Miller, which was, I think, one of the first highly conceptualized packaged designs that there was, and certainly was a point of inspiration for me that Frank had done with Neil Posner, who was my predecessor at DC. We ended up, actually, that's how we ended up with all the text features and those special features in the back of each issue of Watchmen, is because I talked them out of doing ads there. Now we had 6 pages to fill. And so, like, if you can fill them, go right ahead. And the absolute joy of being able to work with Alan and Dave to create those and then design how they would look as a newspaper, as a textbook, or whatever. That will always stand as one of my favorite things in comics ever, certainly. And also at the same time, Frank had talked DC into doing Dark Knight Returns in that little square-bound format, what we call the prestige format, which is the first time DC had ever done that. It was kind of like a mini graphic novel format. And Frank and I met at the Chicago Con and talked about, so what do we see this package as? And we discussed it as, for me, the interior design should be minimal. It should be like you're sitting down in a movie theater and the lights go down and then the story starts. And otherwise you stay out of the way, keep it classy. And that also worked out pretty well too.
Yeah, I'd say so. And another set of books you worked on were the Vertigo books. When you heard of the idea of doing sort of a different way of doing comics, sort of darker comics, more adult comics, did you think that was a good idea, or did you think we should, stick with more of the mainstream?
I'm biased because I'm married to Karen Berger. So she had already been developing books. So much of it, and not to make it the only person in the world, but so much of it came from Alan Moore. Mm. When Alan started handing in those Swamp Thing scripts to Karen, who was the editor at that time, you could tell. You could tell there was something different going on here. There was something more going on here. And so she started to pursue other British talent because she realized American talent always brought an American perspective to American characters. And she thought that if you look at 2000 AD, which is very popular back then, it was a whole different take on characters, whole different take on heroes. Mm-hmm. You know, Judge Dredd is not a character that would have ever organically popped up in American comics, I don't think. Excuse me. So the more she pursued it, the more people, and DC at that time had a wonderful executive staff. Had Jeanette Kahn, first woman to ever be a publisher in comics. Paul Levitz, maybe the smartest guy I've ever known, running the operation. And Dick Giordano, one of the most talented, creative, decent human beings I've ever had the pleasure to work with. And they were very open and receptive to new ideas, especially Jeanette. She was like, bring it. What do you got? And so she noticed what Karen was doing and said, would you like to be our British liaison? And, you know, bring in new talent. And once you start doing that, you realize, wait, there's a whole new sensibility going on with these books. Something different is going on here. And so after a number of years, I worked on her books to a certain degree, but it wasn't until when they said, why don't you make an imprint out of it? You have your own imprint. And then actually at that point, Karen and I were already together, and we started kicking around names. And again, another one of those very fortunate circumstances where I was able to walk in and design the whole thing. So it was cool.
When you saw the books and you heard about doing your own imprint, what was the vision going through your mind of what would make these books different?
That's an interesting question. Well, most importantly was to find a way to package them in such a way that it would reflect the difference in the content, mm-hmm. to separate them out from the superhero books, because that's all there really was at that point. I mean, there was a couple of war titles, maybe, or something, a couple of House of Mysteries, mm-hmm. Which is actually where Karen got her start editing, I think, House of Mysteries. So for me, it was like we figured out that if we wanted the books to stand out, the thing that everybody sees about a book is the cover. So Karen was fighting for getting painted covers because they tended to look more sophisticated, a little bit more mature. And with that, then I was like, how do we handle with the logos and the typography differently? I tried to give some structure to it by coming up with the initial sideband that all the Vertigo books had, to try to put all the information over that side so it didn't float all over the cover. And also ideally to reflect some of the tonality of the book itself. We couldn't do every page inside highly designed because we were trying to pump out 6, 8 titles in a system that was built to just crank out dozens of titles. So no offense to people in production or such, but they needed a formula and a very straightforward, here's what you do. And so it didn't allow for individual creativity on the titles, which is ideal. That's what I would have loved, but it just wasn't practical at the time. So it was just, we did everything we could to step up the design and the look. And then ultimately the collected editions are what really broke the mold entirely.
Definitely. My last question would be, when you start an imprint like this, how important is it for you to put the right team together, the right people that everyone is sort of on the same page and rowing the same direction?
It's really important. It was part of the struggle when I got to DC. Again, they were so used to working old school, where every book was basically the same. It came in, you put the logo on it that Gaspar Saladino designed or something, put the cover image there, boom, the book is done, out the door, put a letter column in the back, it doesn't matter, boom, there it goes out the door, the ad flats, boom. So the trick was to try to break that system out to as much of a degree as we could and set up entirely our own little world. But I was able to make sure that there was always an art director after I had to move on to other responsibilities as creative director. I try to make sure there was always an art director there, ideally one that handled both the publications and the promotion, so there was unity, which was difficult because everything was kind of segmented. This is the marketing department, and this is this department, and you do that. And but we had good people, and we had good luck with it. Not perfect, but we had really good books.
Now, did you design the logo for the Vertigo imprint? Yes. I'm curious,
Yes.
So this was a new imprint. I'm not sure how much DC at that point had sort of experimented in imprints and these sort of side worlds, if you will.
Yeah. Well, they had. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, you can go ahead, or I can add.
Well, I was just going to say that I'd had some experience with this at DC in the late 80s before Vertigo. They took a risk on a imprint called Piranha Press, which was done by a guy, Mark Nevelow, put it together. He had no experience in comics. He was a smart guy, and Jeanette thought he had a vision in him for doing comics differently. So actually, that was one of the first times when we tried to break the mold of DC entirely and try to keep it outside of the system as much as possible. So I personally did a lot of those covers and interior designs and such, because it was a lot of different wacky types of material. There was really no way to put that through the system, as it were. It commercially was not successful. It produced some interesting material. One of Kyle Baker's best books, blank on the title, Mars. What is it?
Why I love
why?
Saturn.
Oh no,
Left
why I hate
Saturn.
Saturn. Why I hate Saturn.
Why I hate Saturn.
Right. Thank you. So there was a little bit of experience with that, which unfortunately left a little bit of a sour taste in other people's mouths, who were like, can we just do superhero comics? They work and blah, blah. But Jeanette and Paul and Dick, to their credit, was like, no, we have to try new things. The medium has to grow. And I think that was so important that a company like DC was willing to push that and stand behind it and promote it and pay for it. So, when Vertigo came along, they were a little bit more comfortable because Karen had been there for a number of years, and they absolutely trusted Karen 100%, as one would. But it helped break some of the groundwork for Vertigo.
That's an interesting backstory to that, because I was wondering if this had been one of the first imprints. I guess it is one of the first imprints.
It's one of the first, yeah.
When you're doing a logo that will now go on a number of books, and hopefully, if successful, which Vertigo was, will be on hundreds of books. Were there a lot of iterations? Did you feel a lot of pressure to come up with the right thing in that situation?
Well, there's always the pressure to come up with the right thing. No, I experimented with a number of different designs, and again, things were small enough, and there was enough trust within us that what Karen and I came up with in terms of what we thought the look and the feel of Vertigo was supposed to be like, Jeanette and Paul and Dick were like, okay, if you think that's the right idea, go for it. And Karen's always been an excellent client for me because she knows what she wants when she sees it. And sometimes she can't elucidate why this doesn't work or that doesn't work, but she has tremendous sense about how things can work. And so coming up with the Vertigo logo was not painful at all. It actually came fairly early on in the process. And then just spreading that out. And I tried to do all the initial promotion, the initial posters, the initial ads, to try to get that look and feel out there as much as possible.
Well, I think it worked perfectly.
Thank you.
I think a lot of others would agree with me. Moving to another topic that you already alluded to, which is collected editions and graphic novels. You were kind of there at the beginning, or at least the beginning of the explosion of this format, and particularly around the series we just talked about, Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, which have become the most successful collected editions, probably maybe number one, number two. Certainly Watchmen is number one. Did you, when you started on these and started putting these stories together into one big package, did you have an inkling that this would be kind of the future of comic books?
Yes. Yes, because it seems so logical. I mean, we had an industry that was pumping out 32-page books once a month that were the last thing you'd ever, that printing, when it went away, that's the last you're ever going to see that comic. Maybe somebody has it in a bin, in a box, in a bag somewhere, but there's really no easy way for you to read that story again. It's gone for all intents and purposes. And Paul Levitz, being the smart lad that he is, realized that comics lacked, we had periodicals, but periodicals come and go. The magazine you read last month really is worthless to you this month. And he realized that if we could become evergreen publishers like book publishers were, you know, there's certain authors, Stephen King, Joseph Heller, you can name a number of them, authors whose work is always in print, because it's good work. And so he and I decided to kind of build a collected editions department. It was a mini department, and start focusing on how we can put these books together and make them look like more than, first of all, you got to make them look like more than they are just a bunch of comic books stuck together. You have to try to, for me, it was like you have to build an entire package around this chapter type, you know, chapters and Disha and title pages and half title pages and more attractive covers. And so I was very fortunate. Again, I've been extremely lucky in my life to be at the right place at the right time. And right then and there, because of the books you cited and others like Swamp Thing and such, it was the perfect place to start building it. And there were no rules. So I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do. The publishers were supportive, and Paul was far-sighted, and it took off, and it changed the industry.
Certainly did. Mostly for the positive, but I wanted to get your take on something that it may have contributed to that, you know, fans are of two minds on, I think, which is the sense that the ongoing series started to, or the serialization of an ongoing series started to chunkify into, you know, 4, 5, 6 issue storylines that better fit trades and collected editions. What are your thoughts on where that went, and do you think there should be more balance between, you know, ongoing titles versus those that are more storylines or mini series?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, it largely comes down to periodicals versus book format. A graphic novel is supposed to be a story, beginning, middle, and end, and you read it and it feels like it's a story. It's not a bunch of collections of anything else. But because we have thousands of years of superhero comics in our background, and commercially speaking, they're viable. The trick was to balance that out and try to put out. In the beginning, we were very picky about what we collected, and partially because it was a new thing, and we didn't want to blow a lot of money, because once you start printing 200, 300 page books, it's not like a comic book. You're going to waste some money. So we ran to that. I remember when we were working on Vertigo early on, Jamie Delano came in, and he had a storyline for a book that he was working on, and it was like an 11-part storyline. And Karen thought it was great, but it was right at the time when we were starting to collect as much as possible that was good. And Paul was like, well, we can't do an 11-issue collection. It won't work. I mean, it's too big. No one's going to pay $35 for this title. And so it really came down to the economics of it, was driving it down to 5 or 6 issues, a couple hundred pages tops. That was a viable, because then you got a viable price point to put out in the marketplace. People would take a chance on maybe a $12 or $15 book, but they wouldn't maybe on a $30 book. Even though it was value priced, it still was just too much for people to risk trying certainly a new title on, or a new series on. So yeah, that's almost inexorable about having an ongoing periodical and then having to collect it together. Something's got to be compromised one way or another until we got solidly into graphic novels.
Makes sense.
Another time period that has some fans divided is the speculation boom of the 90s. And you start to see a lot of gimmick covers. You see the foil, you see the hologram, you see anything you could think of. As someone with an artistic eye, what's going through your mind when you're seeing, pretty common books getting foil covers, or like anything you could think of just to, catch the eye to have them pick up the book?
Yeah. On a number of levels, that's a sad time, because there was so much desperation in the marketplace. There was so much confusion. I mean, Image upset the apple cart tremendously. And it wasn't entirely a bad thing that they did that. But once we hit that collectors, not even the collectors, the investors and the speculators mindset, where somehow people foolishly thought that if you bought 300 copies of this #1 book, you're going to be able to sell it for $1 million someday. And then there was another box and another box and another box. And that didn't really, you couldn't sustain that for very long. Artistically speaking, it's just, come on. It's like, you can put gold on shit. It's still shit. I'm sorry. It's expensive. They're hard to do. They don't usually turn out right. I mean, when I came back to DC in '90s, I was freelance from, I was on staff at DC from 85 to 90. Then I went freelance from 90 to 96, mostly to explore all the new digital tools that were coming out. And then when I came back in 96, it was kind of the tail end of that. And I'm looking at these lenticular covers going, what? What does it do? What does it add to the story? What does it add to the experience, really? Ooh, nah.
Agreed.
I wanted to go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, Karen never wanted to have anything to do with anything like that. She'd get in these fights with marketing and stuff, and she's like, "No, we're not doing that. It's stupid." Sorry, I just had it.
I will say I was a goofy kid who did buy every foil cover that I saw.
Yeah.
If you were a kid at the time, it made a lot of sense. But they were cool looking. I mean, they look cool. Some of them, not all of them.
It's like a fish seeing something shiny. I just go right towards it and have.
Well, that's a human nature.
There you go.
Yeah, I think age and maturity, or immaturity in our case, had a lot to do with it. Although I think it would be funny to have a artifact from that period where it was just one Vertigo book just randomly would have everything every piece of gimmick on it.
Every bell, every whistle,
Exactly.
little sound
Lenticular
chip
foils,
inside when
glow
you
in the
open it up.
dark, polybagged, everything. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that period between 1990 and 96, where you formed your own design firm, Brainstorm Unlimited. Just curious what what kind of work you were doing there. I mean, it's from our very surface level research, you're doing some work with some of the channels such as HBO, Children Television Workshop, which of course does Sesame Street. I'd love to know just kind of the nature of that work, the diversity of that work, and what you enjoyed about it.
Well, when I had my first studio in Madison, I did everything I could do. I do pizza boxes, I do menus, I do ads, I would do anything. Partially because I was learning, and I realized that to learn, you want to get as much exposure to as many things as you possibly can. But when I left in '90, I had the intent of starting a studio with Dean Motter. And Dean was a fairly well-known, there was a crew of us that were designers in the comic book industry in the early 80s. It was about 3 or 4 of us. There weren't very many. And Dean was one of them. And between that and the fact that I had gone to a demonstration of a program that would ultimately be called Photoshop, and I saw what they could do with this program. And I'm talking about 89 or something. So it didn't do a lot, but nobody had ever done anything like this before. It was impossible. You had to go into a dark room and try to get whatever results you get out of an image. So between that and how the Macintosh allowed people to set their own type, do their own layouts. I mean, in the late 80s, I was ordering out type in like these strips to be pasted down on the board, and it'd be like $30, $50, and a messenger would come and he'd take it and he'd come back 12 hours later and it'd be wrong and he'd have to take it back again. So the digital tools were really starting to come to the forefront. And that was one of the few things that Paul Levis did not see coming. He thought, I used to bring my old Macintosh 512K into work and put it on my desk. Because he wouldn't buy a computer for the company because he was like, it's just for games. It's all for games, Richard. What are you doing? And so God love him, but he wouldn't budge on that. And I knew from what I was seeing, this was going to be a big fucking thing. This is where the business was going to go because there was no reason why it wouldn't. It was so much easier. You could do so much more. You could do new things. And so a lot of me leaving in 1990 was I wanted to try these tools out and see how many ways I could apply them and what I could learn from them. So that was probably the major driving force getting me out of the company. And it worked for me because I had the opportunity. One of my earliest assignments at Brainstorm was designing covers for Vertigo. And we did a lot with photographic covers and design mixed together. Best example being Sandman Mystery Theater, one of my personal favorites that I did 75 covers for with a wonderful photographer, Gavin Wilson. And we really merged the design and the photography together. It wasn't like just a picture stuck down on the board. And then there was other Stephen John Phillips and Chiaroscuro and different titles. So I knew I was doing something that hadn't been done before. It was great. There was no rules. I just made it up. And people seemed to like it.
I thought it was very cool. and you brought back those tools that you were experimenting with back to DC when you became a creative director, right, in 1996.
Right.
When you look back at that second stint with DC, what are you most proud of there? What was the type of work that you would look back on as being sort of high water marks?
Creative director was a different kind of job. It was much broader. I was creative director for the entire company, And when I came back in 96, because of the boom that had happened in the early 90s, and things like, more movies coming out about the characters and stuff, licensing was taking off because there were movies. So I was creative director for all the different divisions or departments within DC. So I really couldn't drill down and focus on very many narrow areas. I mean, I remember coming back and collected editions were kind of messed up and they'd kind of fallen to the wayside. So I worked on helping to clean that up. And then I got distracted helping to convert Wildstorm into DC. I got to be the liaison between Wildstorm and DC, which was a wonderful experience. Great people at Wildstorm. But I think one of the things I'm proudest of was Zuda, because it was DC's first digital line, and it was just original material and reflective of the internet. It was, people coming in from the outside of the business, pitching us stuff through the internet. And then we had people vote on it, and then we would post it. And then if we were lucky, we got to put a print version out of it. But it was that was very exciting to me because I learned a lot about the internet, which was still pretty raw at that point, early 2000s and such. So that was Zuda. That was a lot of work. That was because the DC was not set up for that at all. Payment systems, contracts, production, nothing easily adapted to Zuda. So we really, Ron Peraz, I have to give a big shout out to him. He was my director of creative services. That really was the hands-on everyday guy. And that was a lot of work, but I'm still very proud of that.
I have a special place in my heart for Zuda. My friend was one of the editors, Kwanzaa Asajifo.
Kwanzaa.
Yes. And I submitted a couple of stories.
Oh, you did?
Yes, we did not win either of mine. Although, we thought we were the best, but it was so experimental. Just the format, the fact that it was all online, the voting possibility. I really thought that was just such an interesting, I'm biased, of course, now showing my colors, but just something so different and democratizing about that, that, I think it was just a really special project and a special time. I wish it had continued, but I think basically the rest of the world became more democratizing, and sort of we began voting with our wallets and our views and things like that. And so Zuda was a little bit ahead of its time in that respect. But I'm glad you brought that up. And I neglected to think that you were there during that, and you had in fact had a great hand in it. So
yeah.
I will say thank you for my previous experience with it.
Well, you're very welcome. I remember we were at an editorial once a year. All the editors and me and Dick Giordano and Jeanette and everybody would get together at some retreat somewhere and spend 2 or 3 days talking about what do we see DC doing in the next year or so and beyond. And I was like, we have to do digital comics, you realize. And people are like, I'm like, hello, this stuff's going digital. It's not going to go back. It's only going to go forward. And I had a lot of support from Jim Lee at that time, who saw the future, as you can tell by his entire career. And so it was a lot of work to do. And it was, like you say, the intersection of where the internet was at that time with what we were trying to do. Again, we were probably a couple years too soon. Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. Maybe it would have. All I know is that having to deal with Flash animation was a pain in the ass, and that's the way that we ultimately ended up setting it up for a wide variety of reasons. I mean, Flash was very dominant at the time. But it was so limiting, as everybody realized after a few years of working the Flash. So that was a little frustrating. We couldn't do as much as we wanted to do with the content once we had it, but it was the most goddamn earnest thing anybody's ever done. We would just, Ron and Kwanzaa, and we had a small gang there. Dave McCullough, who's our tech guy. It was a fabulous experience.
Great. The only other thing I wanted to ask about that time period, and wonder how, your opinion of what happened after that, is that the DC, back to logos. I guess I'm showing my colors as sort of a logo fanatic, but the DC logo changed rather dramatically. I think they called this version the Spin.
The Spin.
Which
I named it the Spin.
You named it the Spin, and you designed it. Is that correct?
No, I art directed it. Interestingly, I've been bugging DC for a number of years about redesigning the DC logo because, Milton Glaser is a giant in graphic design, and he came up with that, the DC Bullet, as it was called, in 76 or 77. The problem with it was built to be big and on the covers, bleeding off the upper portion of the cover. That's the only way it really worked. You couldn't put it smaller somewhere. It looked a little funny floating on its own sometimes. It had little hairlines around the letter shapes and the circle that didn't reproduce very well when you reduced it. And once everybody had computers, you could do anything with a logo that you were given. Things that you shouldn't do, like make it too small or make it too big, whatever. But I just saw it as it was too much of a circus poster for what we were going into starting in the 80s, in the mid 80s. One of my first things to do was I took the DC logo and I made it very small to put it on Dark Knight Returns. Because that was the only, and I straightened it up, which Jeanette did not like at all. Jeanette was very tight with Milton. But it just didn't seem to address the needs of the company and the medium at that point. So when I came back on staff in the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s, I'm like, can we please try again, And the only difficulty was that Jeanette wanted to go back to Milton Glaser to have him do the new design, which is okay. But he's Milton Glaser, so it's kind of like, here it is. And you're like, okay, here's the check. Thank you very much. And he didn't really get it at first. I didn't feel he got it. And I will never forget the fact that Jeanette and Paul were willing to write off a very large investment and then shit can it because I said it wouldn't work. I'll never get over that. But then years later, when the first Christopher Nolan Batman movie was coming up and we were preparing for it, we had a new president come in from Warner Brothers, Kevin Tsujihara, and he had heard I wanted a new logo, and he wanted a new logo because then he could put his mark on that. That's my new DC Comics. I didn't care what his motivation was. And he said, yeah, do it. I want it out. I want it on the movie. And so we met with a lot of designers, got a lot of sketches in, did a blind test with 5 different designs from 5 different designers. And the one that Paul chose was the guy that I sold my studio to when I left Brainstorm to come back to DC, who was a tremendously talented young designer, Josh Bateman. And so everyone always said, oh yeah, you gave it to your guy. I'm like, it was blind. Nobody knew who did what. So I was very happy with that. People had very mixed reactions. Some of them just didn't like the fact that there was a no bullet. Spin, as I called it. But I just felt it was better than what we had. It had some energy and some excitement, and it looked scientific, science fiction-y or something. I don't know. But then things changed, and the corporation was taken over by another corporation, and then you got the peel, and then you got the flip and the whoop, and so I got 7 years out of the DC Spin, and I'm happy for that.
Yeah, I mean, you finally got your logo change, and then they went logo change happy and just kept changing.
Just change it and change it again.
Right, change it back, change it again, change it this way.
Did you ever see that? There was very early on a YouTube video about a guy reacting to the new DC logo. It's a very funny little bit. He's like in his room and he opens up a comic book and sees it and he starts screaming, runs outside. Oh my God, anyway, sorry.
That could be a video for just about any change in the world of comic books.
Exactly.
We fans are very, very, very change averse.
Yeah. So what projects are you working on now? What's next?
Well, for the last 4 years, after Karen, I left DC in 2010. They were getting ready to move the company to the West Coast, and Karen and I didn't want to move to the West Coast. So I took the opportunity to bow out, then go back to freelancing. Karen left a couple years later, sat around, not sure what she wanted to do. Ultimately, wanted to get back into comics again, which is all right and good because she's really fantastic at it. And so she worked with Mike Richardson at Dark Horse to set up Berger Books. That was my idea, Berger Books. She would have never called it Berger Books. She doesn't have that kind of ego. But it made the most sense because that was what we were selling. And so, yeah, so for here's some of our recent titles.
Very cool.
Probably the last year or so. So, yeah, so we started putting out comics and graphic novels. And the only thing that kind of derailed us, whatever, was COVID. And when COVID hit, all the comic series that we had, because we were doing comic series largely, a few graphic novels that are original contained graphic novels, but there was a certain amount of them that were collected editions. But once the COVID hit, we didn't the sale. I mean, everybody stopped publishing for a while. Everybody stopped doing everything for a while. And by the time things started cranking back up again, there was so much of an incredible backlog of comics, especially from the big publishers, into the system that you really couldn't compete. It was very hard to compete at all. So a decision was made to stop publishing periodical comics and just work towards book collections and then original graphic novels after that. So we wrapped up a couple of series that way. And so in the last, year and a half, because we slowed down for a long while there, we've just been doing graphic novels like this with the occasional, Karen has a couple of series that she worked on previously. My favorite being Enigma, which is a tremendous book if you haven't seen it. I'm very proud of that book. That's, I think, one of my best design jobs ever. But putting a few things into print again. Air is another one from Vertigo, and then most of them are all original properties with great people, really nice people to work with, and we have nobody to argue with. It's just Karen and I. So Mike doesn't bother us at all. He signs the checks and says, "There you go." And so we don't have as much money as we'd like to, but
you're doing all right.
Yeah, right. But it's good. We're having a lot of fun with it still. Slowing down a little bit just because not getting younger. What the hell?
I think the freedom probably, or the creative freedom, is probably worth
it's worth
the trade-off.
It's well worth it. It's well worth it.
So Richard, we'd love to know, or fans would love to know, where they can follow your work. And in fact, we can point them to Berger Books as well. But do you have any social media presence or website where they can follow you, or should we send them straight to Berger Books?
There's one problem with sending them straight to Berger Books is, at least on Twitter, there's another Berger Books that preceded us.
No.
So every time somebody uses, hashtag Berger or at Berger Books, it doesn't come to us. I've been trying to push to get a Berger Books DH for Dark Horse going, but it's very hard. People are just the very literal. I'm on Twitter a fair amount. I had my last account canned because I said something nasty about Devin Nunes. But I think my current one is like Rich_Bruning or Bruning_Rich. I'm not sure. I have a website. Well, it's part of Adobe Behance portfolios, which hasn't been updated in literally years, but has all my early Berger Books work and stuff going back, including some of the stories that I wrote way back in the day. And spending way too much time on TikTok, but not creating yet. So it's about it. It's about it. I don't spend much time on Facebook or Instagram at this point. But
Just so you know, it's at Bruning_Rich on Twitter.
thank you, sir. Thank you. I have to put that on my business card if I had one.
Don't tell Devin Nunes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he's not even on there anymore, right? He's running Truth Social,
Yeah.
where you're
Yeah.
truthing things instead of tweeting
Yeah,
things.
he's truthing all over the place.
Exactly. We won't wade into the political waters.
No. We'll be here all night.
Well, we wanted to thank you, Richard, for coming on the show, for talking about your career and being very forthright in, things that happen and your perspective on, comics, even those that you haven't worked on. We appreciate all of your work, and we wish you the best of luck in the future. We'll be definitely on looking out for new releases from Berger Books, and thank you.
And we're back. This is a great episode, guys. I didn't know too much about Richard prior to, and he's done quite a bit, worn many hats over his career, which I can certainly appreciate. And I think you guys did a great job with this one.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, he was a fantastic guest, a very funny guy. And I think what Mike said earlier is true. This is sort of one of the unsung heroes of comics, and we're just happy to, kind of tell his story and hear what he had to say about his time in the industry.
Yeah, if you think about, we take two of the examples to really hold up, Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, and think about how, the use of yellow in Watchmen and those little additional kind of design things at the back of those issues were really part of his doing. And also, Dark Knight Returns, kind of that format and really striking, cover images, not to mention how Frank Miller's art and writing were sort of perceived on the page. Anyway, it's just really fascinating stuff. And you should definitely check out Berger Books, which Richard Bruning works on with his wife. That's part of the Dark Horse line of comics. But that will do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and we will see you next time.